My dear brothers and sisters, I'd like to reflect with you once again about marriage. And today I'd like to use the book of Ruth. Ruth is a book in the Bible that is unlike any other. It gives us a beautiful story, and through the story, it gives us a wonderful message. The story itself is not extraordinary. It is about the everyday events in our lives. It is what you and I would have experienced day in and day out. And yet it gives us a deep, intense theological meaning into God and His working in our lives. So let's begin with the book itself. The book is divided into 4 chapters, and each of these chapters give us a glimpse of the story. And so the first chapter introduces the entire scene. There is a famine that takes place in Israel, and so Naomi and her husband go to Moab, which is a neighboring place, and they live there. At this place, Naomi's husband dies, and his 2 sons marry 2 of the Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Both these boys also die. And so Naomi is left with her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she tells them she has nothing left to really live for in this place, and so she's returning back to her homeland. In this scenario, she tells both her daughters-in-law, you go back to your family because the status of a widow isn't all that great in Israel, and so you'd probably be better off with your families here. Now Orpah listens and goes back to her people, but Ruth, she says something that is bold, something that is decisive, and something that is really unheard of. She says, wherever you go, I shall go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Oftentimes, my dear brothers and sisters, when we have marriages, especially when we have interreligious marriages, we always have this issue of who's going to follow which religion, who's going to do what, and how do we manage things, etc. And this first chapter of the book of Ruth gives us a great insight into what marriage is all about. This isn't so much about joining religions. It isn't so much about joining mindsets. It is about joining lives. When you marry, it's not just a person that you marry, but you're marrying the entire ethos that comes with the person. And therefore, a marriage is much more than just the other partner. While the other partner is the essential part and is the key, there is much more to marriage than just meets the eye. Right? And so this first chapter of the book of Ruth gives us this whole experience of Ruth, who is, mind you, not an Israelite. She is a Moabite. And yet she shows this great faith in the God of Israel, this great faith in being joined permanently to Israel, even though her own husband has died. And she is willing to take the risk of living with her mother-in-law. And as these 2 widows return to Israel, Naomi changes her name to Mara, which means bitter, to highlight the bitterness in her life. It is bad enough that there is 1 widow, but now 2 widows means even bigger problems. Widows were not considered such great people in Israel, and they had absolutely no rights. They were considered as nobodies or non-persons. Now imagine that multiplied by 2, and that makes it all the more difficult for them to survive. Chapter 2 begins with a discussion between Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth as to what they're going to do for food. Where are they going to go to get food? How are they going to get their daily bread? And so Ruth says she will go and glean the food from the neighboring fields. It is the barley harvest, and the people are gathering in the sheaves of barley. And obviously, when the workers gather in the sheaves, there is always a little grain that falls. And she says, I'll collect those and I will bring that home for food for us. Now, she happens to go into a field that belongs to a man called Boaz. And Boaz is a relative of Naomi, but not just any relative. He is a relative who is called a relative redeemer, which means it's a concept here in Israel that if a man dies, then his nearest next of kin would marry his widow and also take possession of the land so as to carry on his name. And so Boaz is one such redeemer, kinsman redeemer. And as she goes and starts gathering the grains, Boaz notices her and makes inquiries of her. And when he realizes the story of this great woman who has really left everything to come back home to Israel and to her mother in law and be with her mother in law, he's amazed and he makes a number of concessions for her, including giving her extra grain and so on. And so that evening, as Ruth returns home, Naomi asks her where she's got all this grain from. And then she narrates the entire story. Now, this whole chapter 2 reminds us of what can be done if we look for solutions. Very often there are problems in our life and problems in our marriage. And yet there is always a solution to be found. And as we go ahead trying to find these solutions, God works and cooperates with our effort, bringing us back home with more than what we expected. As we move to chapter 3, we recognize that now Naomi, knowing who Boaz is, recommends that Ruth presents herself to Boaz as a prospective bride, since Boaz has the right to marry Ruth according to their customs. And so that is precisely what is done. And the whole of chapter 3 has this discussion between Boaz and Ruth. And Boaz says that I am willing to do this provided there is somebody who is closer in relationship to your family, to Naomi, than I am. If he declines, then I will marry you and I will take over the land, etc. And so we come to the next chapter where we have this whole scenario where Boaz calls the townspeople together, the elders together, and he calls the nearest relative redeemer. And he says, well, so and so is a thing. And as this man realizes that he would have to marry Ruth, he says, well, I do not want to redeem. You can redeem the bride as well as the land. And that is exactly what Boaz does. And Boaz and Ruth are married. And the story ends by telling us that Naomi, who lost her husband and who lost her sons, now gets a new son in a way, and now also gets a grandson. She gets the grandson of a grandson named Obed, who is the grandfather of King David. And so the book ends with a genealogy, giving us a list of people who come from Boaz and Ruth. And we find that Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. And from David comes the Messiah. What does this book tell us? What is amazing about this book, first of all, is that God is not mentioned as doing anything. And that's something really, really amazing. You would think that a book in the Bible would tell us about what God is doing. But this is one such book that does not have, in fact, God is hardly ever mentioned here. It's only mentioned in a blessing. But God is at the background. Secondly, this book is not some high theological literature. It is about everyday life, as I have narrated the story to you. And this story, my dear brothers and sisters, is really a story that we experience in life, in society, isn't it? Each one of us recognizes that people are married, people die, and life goes on. But what is important and what this book really emphasizes is how God works in the background. God works in the background, seeing to the positive ending of everyone's life. We may not recognize it at the beginning, but as we come to a close, we recognize all the blessings that God has done for us, has given us. And I'm sure you can recognize this in your own life. When you're in the midst of a very difficult situation, you find it really difficult to understand, to comprehend, and you ask the question, where is God? But a couple of years down the line, and you recognize that God was there helping you, healing you, holding you by the hand, and rescuing you. This is our experience. Every one of us, each one of us has experienced this in one way or another. And I'd like, my dear brothers and sisters, that we reflect on this from the perspective of the book as well. Because what begins in the book is death, and what the way the book ends is with life. The book begins with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitterness. And at the end, this bitterness is turned to joy. And so we can see clearly that God works in the background using three characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. This book beautifully brings out a play of life. And in this play, each person really experiences God's touch in their own life. What Naomi thinks that everything is lost, everything is actually gained at the end of the book. And so, what does this teach us about marriage? It teaches us faithfulness. It teaches us what it means to trust and to continue. It teaches us what it means to persevere. It teaches us the value of life. It teaches us the value of continually pursuing what we have embraced. And this, my dear brothers and sisters, is really the beauty of this book. Very often in life and in our marriages, we don't really experience God's touch or God's hand, but God is there in the background, working things out for us, working with us, working with our decisions. And this book really encourages us. This book really encourages us to go on in life, embracing everything that comes along, knowing that even if things don't seem very nice, don't seem very palatable, they are at the end God's working. And God chooses to lead us by a winding road, but He definitely brings us to a destination. And that destination is where we receive His blessings. What we require then is perseverance. When we look at marriage, my dear brothers and sisters, today, we find that marriages are very, very flimsy sometimes. We hear of so many divorces. We hear of people marrying and remarrying, kinds of things. And we wonder sometimes what happened to the permanence of marriage. And this book really reminds us to focus on that, because marriage is between man and woman, true, but the one that joins them together is God, because God is love. And love is what we exchange with one another in every nuptial rite, in every marriage. We promise to be true. We promise to live together till death do us apart. And this book, in very, very simple terms, in everyday language, invites us to experience the joys of marriage. The joys sometimes gift wrapped in very boring wrapping paper, in very difficult wrapping paper, in very challenging wrapping paper, but a gift nonetheless. If we only look beyond the gift wrapping paper, we recognize the beauty of the gift, the magnanimity with which God gives us this gift. As we continue reflecting on our marriage, I invite you, my dear brothers and sisters, to read the book of Ruth. In the ups and downs in your own marriage or in any relationship that you have, read the book of Ruth, because it will tell you how to continue, how to persevere, and how to trust that you are important enough for God to work in the background of your life. He has His eyes set on you, and He wants to do marvelous things with you. If you give Him a chance and you allow Him with patience, with understanding, then God will make a way where there seems to be no way. God is with you, and God will bring to fruition the seeds of love that you have sown in your marriage. I wish you all a very happy married life. Those of you who are preparing for marriage, all the best. recognize that God blesses your decision and God is with you. God bless.